The street was quiet that evening, the kind of stillness that made every little sound echo in the air. A young woman walked back from the market, carrying a small bag of vegetables. As she passed by one of the old houses, she noticed the curtains slightly moving, as if someone inside had been watching. That house had always caught her attention. The paint on the walls was faded, the fence leaned to one side, and the garden looked untouched for years. Yet she often felt as if someone inside was quietly observing the world outside without stepping into it. That day, as she slowed her pace, she saw an elderly man step onto the porch. His back was slightly bent, and his face carried deep lines of age and weariness. He didn't smile, didn't wave, but his eyes lingered on her longer than usual. A young woman kept walking, but something about the sight of him stayed in her mind. There was a certain loneliness in the way he stood there, a silence heavier than words. Later that night, while cooking dinner for herself, she couldn't shake the image of him. She thought about how empty his house looked, how no one seemed to visit him, and how his frail hands trembled when he held onto the porch railing. Without planning it, she set aside an extra portion of food. It wasn't much, just a simple meal, but it was warm, and it was made with care. She wrapped it neatly and decided to walk back to the old house. When she reached his door, her heart beat a little faster. She wondered if he might reject her kindness or feel insulted. Still, she knocked gently. For a long moment, there was no sound, and she almost turned away. Then slowly the door opened. The elderly man looked surprised, his eyes narrowing as if trying to understand why someone was at his door at that hour. She smiled softly and held out the wrapped meal. "I thought you might like something warm to eat," she said in a calm voice. He didn't answer at first, just stared at the food as though unsure what to make of it. His lips parted, but no words came out. Then, after what felt like forever, he nodded slightly and reached out with a shaky hand. He took the package, still without speaking, but his eyes glistened as if they carried unspoken gratitude. The young woman gave him a small nod and stepped back. She didn't want to intrude or force conversation. As she turned to leave, she heard the quiet sound of the door closing behind her. Walking back home, she wondered if she had done the right thing. Yet deep inside, she felt it was. The next evening, she thought about him again. Her day had been long, but as she prepared dinner, she felt that same pull to make a little extra. This time she added more effort, preparing something she knew carried comfort, the kind of meal that felt like home. She walked once again to his house, holding the warm container close. When she knocked, the door opened faster than before. This time, the man looked at her with softer eyes. He still didn't speak much, but his hands didn't shake as much when he accepted the food. A faint smile, barely visible, crossed his lips. That was all the young woman needed to know her gesture mattered. On her way back, she thought about how many people pass by others every single day without noticing their quiet struggles. She realized how easy it was to overlook loneliness, especially when it hides behind old walls and closed doors. The man may have had nothing to say, but the way he looked at the food told a story of hunger, of gratitude, and perhaps even hope. From that day on, it became a silent routine. Each evening, before she ate her own meal, she set aside a portion for the man. She never expected thanks, never asked questions, and never demanded conversation. She simply knocked on his door, handed over the food, and left. And each day, the man seemed a little less guarded, his eyes a little brighter, as though the warmth of the meals was slowly breaking through the cold loneliness that surrounded him. The young woman never told anyone in the neighborhood what she was doing. It wasn't about recognition or praise. It was about knowing that a simple act of kindness could reach places words could not. She didn't know anything about his past, didn't know his family or his story. All she knew was that no one deserved to be forgotten or left behind, especially in the last chapters of their life. What she didn't realize was that this quiet routine of kindness would soon uncover a secret far beyond anything she had ever imagined a truth that would not only surprise her but change the way she looked at life itself. But for now, in those quiet evenings, it was just a young woman with a caring heart, and a lonely old man learning, piece by piece, what it meant to feel seen again. The days kept moving quietly, and soon it was no longer a one-time act of kindness. The young woman had made it a part of her daily life to bring food to the elderly man. It wasn't anything grand or expensive, just whatever she cooked for herself. Sometimes it was rice and vegetables, other times it was soup, and occasionally she even baked bread just to add something special. Each meal was carried with the same thought in mind, that someone out there should not go hungry or feel forgotten. The old man, who once seemed so withdrawn, began to wait for her visits. She noticed how his porch light would be switched on earlier, as if he expected her. When she knocked, he would open the door faster, and though his words were still few, his eyes spoke louder each day. There was something fragile about him, as though years of loneliness had built walls he didn't know how to break. And yet, the simple act of receiving food was slowly breaking those walls down. The young woman never tried to force conversations. She would hand him the meal, smile, and sometimes say, "I hope you like this one." He would nod and once in a while, whisper a soft thank you. Those little words meant more to her than she could explain. They were proof that even the quietest souls longed for connection, that kindness could stir emotions where silence had settled for too long. One evening, as she handed him the food, she noticed something different. His eyes drifted to a small chair by the doorway, and then back at her, as if he wanted her to stay for a moment. She hesitated but then gently asked, "Would you like me to sit for a bit?" He nodded slowly. That night, for the first time, she stepped inside his home. The house was simple but filled with a kind of heaviness. Old furniture lined the small living room, and a faint smell of dust lingered in the air. On a wooden shelf sat several framed photographs, most of them worn and faded. One picture caught her eye, a younger version of the old man standing beside a boy who looked no older than 10. They seemed happy, smiling in the sunlight, but the photo looked like it belonged to a different lifetime. She didn't ask about it, though she was curious. Instead, she sat quietly as he ate. The old man ate slowly, carefully, as though savoring every bite. When he finished, he set the plate aside and looked at her with tired eyes. His lips parted, and for the first time, he spoke more than a few words. "You remind me of someone I used to know," he said in a low, almost broken voice. She didn't ask who. She only smiled softly and replied, "I'm glad I could remind you of someone." After that evening, sitting with him for a short while became part of the routine. Sometimes they exchanged only a few sentences, but in that silence was a comfort neither of them had expected. She could sense that behind his quietness, there were stories he carried, stories he wasn't ready to share yet. The neighbors noticed her visits. Some were curious, whispering about why a young woman would spend so much time helping a man who barely spoke to anyone. But she paid no attention to their words. She knew her reasons were simple and honest. It wasn't about what people thought, it was about what felt right in her heart. As the days went on, the old man began to share small pieces of his past. He spoke about the house, how he had lived there for decades. He mentioned his late wife once, his voice trembling slightly, and quickly changed the subject. He told her about how he used to work in a factory, long before his health declined. Each fragment of his life came slowly, like puzzle pieces, but he never spoke about the boy in the photograph. The young woman never pressed him. She knew that people open up when they feel safe, not when they are pushed. For now, her presence and the meals were enough to make a difference. Sometimes, when she left his home late in the evening, she would think about how strange life could be. Two people, from completely different worlds, brought together by something as simple as food. She never thought her small effort would matter this much, but she could see the changes in him. He looked less weary, more alive, As if the burden of being invisible had started to lift that, she began to feel something, too. A quiet sense of responsibility, not out of duty but out of care. She didn't see him as just an old neighbor anymore. She saw him as someone who carried a story, someone whose loneliness could be softened with kindness. And although she didn't know it yet, every visit was pulling her closer to a truth far bigger than she could ever imagine. What she didn't realize was that, behind those photographs, behind the silence about his family, was a secret hidden so carefully that even she would be stunned when it came to light. But for now, in those quiet evenings, kindness was all that mattered, and their bond was slowly becoming something more meaningful than either of them had expected. The young woman's visits had now become the highlight of the old man's days. He had gone from waiting quietly behind his curtain to sitting by the window in the late afternoon, watching the street, hoping to catch the moment she walked toward his house with a warm meal in her hands. His life, once silent and lonely, was beginning to feel alive again, and though he didn't say it outright, the sparkle in his eyes whenever he opened the door told her everything. On one particular evening, after handing him the plate, she noticed the way his hands lingered on the edge of the door. It was as if he didn't want her to leave just yet. Without asking, she stepped inside and sat in the familiar chair she had used before. He shuffled slowly toward the sofa, his movements heavy but steady, and lowered himself into it. For a while, the only sound was the quiet clinking of his spoon against the plate. She sat patiently, letting him take his time. After finishing, he leaned back and let out a tired sigh. His gaze wandered to the shelf with the photographs again. This time, the young woman followed his eyes and allowed herself to ask softly, "Is that your family?" The old man's expression shifted. He didn't speak right away, but eventually he nodded. "My wife," he whispered, pointing at one picture, "and my boy." His voice caught slightly on those words, and he didn't say more. She gave him a kind smile, not pressing for details. She had learned that his silences carried meaning. Still, she could sense the weight those photos held. She wondered why his son, who must be grown now, was never around. The thought of such distance between family members tugged at her heart, but she chose not to ask. Instead, she said gently, "You must be proud of him." The old man lowered his eyes, his lips pressing into a thin line, as if the words stirred something too heavy to bring forward. Over the next few weeks, their evenings together grew warmer. Sometimes he shared small stories of his younger days, working at the factory, fishing at a nearby lake with his boy, and how his wife used to hum while cooking. These stories came like drops of water breaking a long drought, slowly but steadily, reminding him what it felt like to talk about life. The young woman listened carefully, never interrupting, her heart quietly moved by his memories. One day, as she set the food on the small table, she noticed something new. On the wall, a calendar was marked with a circle on one date. She pointed at it with curiosity, and he followed her eyes. He looked at the date for a long time before saying, "It's his birthday." He didn't need to explain who. The silence that followed was heavy, but she filled it with kindness. "Maybe one day you'll celebrate together again," she said, her voice soft and hopeful. The old man gave a faint smile, but his eyes carried a sadness too deep to hide. The bond between them grew stronger. It wasn't just about food anymore. It was about presence. She brought laughter into his lonely evenings, telling small stories from her own day, like a funny incident at the market or a kind word from a stranger. He listened quietly, and though he rarely laughed, his eyes softened with every word. In return, he began to share more of his own thoughts, little things he had never told anyone else. Still, the mystery of his son lingered. She noticed how, whenever the topic of family arose, he either grew quiet or changed the subject. She respected his silence, but deep inside, she wondered who the man in the photo had become, and why he wasn't there for his father. One evening, as she prepared to leave, the old man reached out suddenly, placing a fragile hand over hers. She looked at him in surprise. His voice was low but steady. "You've given me more than food," he said. "You've given me a reason to keep going." Her eyes softened, and though she didn't know what to say, she gave his hand a gentle squeeze. Walking home that night, she felt the weight of his words in her heart. What had started as a simple gesture had become something far more important, not just for him, but for her as well. She was learning how much even the smallest kindness could mean to someone who felt forgotten, but she still didn't know that behind his silence about his son lay a truth far bigger than anything she had imagined. A truth that would soon come to light, shaking her understanding of everything she thought she knew about the quiet man living in that old house. The evening felt different that day. The young woman carried the meal as usual, but as she turned onto the old man's street, she noticed something unusual. A sleek black car stood parked in front of his worn-down house. Its polished surface reflected the fading sunlight, looking completely out of place in the quiet, modest neighborhood. She slowed her steps, her heart beating a little faster. It wasn't common to see such luxury here. As she approached the porch, she saw the old man standing by the doorway, but he wasn't alone. A tall, well-dressed man was beside him, his posture straight and confident. His suit was sharp, his shoes gleamed, and there was a quiet authority in the way he carried himself. The young woman felt a rush of uncertainty. Had she interrupted something important? She almost considered turning back, but the old man's eyes lit up when he saw her. He raised a hand, a gesture for her to come closer. For the first time, the young woman hesitated, clutching the food in her hands. The suited man turned to look at her, his eyes curious but calm. She walked up the steps, and the old man introduced her with a rare effort in his voice. "This is the one," he said, his tone heavier than usual. "She's the one who brings me meals every day." The stranger's eyes softened with surprise, and then, to her shock, he extended his hand politely. "Thank you," he said simply. His voice was deep and steady, the kind that belonged to someone used to being heard. She shook his hand, unsure of what to say. The old man motioned her inside, and together, the three of them entered the small living room. The young woman sat in her usual chair, but the presence of the visitor filled the space with an energy she hadn't felt before. The stranger sat beside his father, and for a moment, the air was thick with unspoken emotions. The old man seemed both proud and uneasy, as though he wasn't used to having his son there. The stranger finally spoke. "My father told me about you," he said, looking at her with genuine interest. "I had to see for myself." She blinked in surprise. "Told you? About me?" she asked softly. The old man lowered his eyes, and the younger man continued. "He said you've been bringing him food every day. That you've been keeping him company when no one else bothered." The young woman's cheeks warmed, and she shifted in her seat. "It wasn't much," she said quickly. "I just didn't want him to be alone." The suited man studied her for a moment, as though weighing her words, and then gave a small nod. "Most people wouldn't bother. What you did means more than you realize." She set the meal on the table, still unsure how to process the situation. That was when the truth began to unfold. The visitor leaned back slightly, his expression calm but serious. "I should probably introduce myself properly," he said. "My name carries a little weight in this city." He said it without pride, almost reluctantly, but when she heard it, her heart nearly skipped a beat. She had read about him in newspapers and seen his face on television. He wasn't just successful, he was one of the most well-known billionaires in the country. Her eyes darted to the old man in disbelief. She looked back at the son, struggling to find her voice. You're his son?" she finally asked. He nodded, his expression solemn. "Yes, and I have failed him in ways I can't explain. My work, my empire, all of it. It kept me away. I thought money could replace presence, but I see now it cannot." The old man shifted uncomfortably, his eyes wet but refusing to spill tears. The room felt heavy, filled with truths that had been buried for too long. The young woman sat silently, her heart pounding with a mix of shock and sadness. She had spent weeks feeding a man who had seemed so forgotten, never realizing that his son was a billionaire, a man whose name carried power and influence. The billionaire turned his eyes back to her. "And yet, while I was too busy, you stepped in. You gave him what I couldn't. You gave him care." His words carried both gratitude and guilt. She didn't know how to respond. She had never thought of her actions as anything more than simple kindness. But now, sitting across from one of the wealthiest men in the country, she realized that her quiet gesture had done something money could never buy. It had touched a heart that wealth had left empty. That night, as she walked back home, the image of the luxury car stayed in her mind. But even more so, the look in both men's eyes, the old man's quiet relief, and the son's silent regret. The secret was out now, and nothing between them would ever be the same again. The night after meeting the old man's son, the young woman could hardly sleep. Her thoughts kept circling back to the moment when she realized who he was. A billionaire, someone whose name appeared in magazines and business headlines, sitting in that tiny living room beside his frail father. It felt almost unreal. But beyond the surprise, what stayed in her heart was the way the son had looked at his father, with guilt, with longing, and with a kind of regret that no amount of money could erase. The next evening, she returned as usual with a warm meal in her hands. This time, both father and son were waiting at the door. The billionaire rose from the porch step as she approached, his sharp suit replaced with a simple sweater, his presence no less commanding but somehow gentler. He greeted her with a small nod and said, "We were hoping you'd join us for dinner tonight." For a moment, she hesitated. She wasn't used to being asked inside like family. But when she saw the old man's hopeful eyes, she couldn't refuse. She stepped inside, setting the meal on the table. The three of them sat together in the modest living room, the billionaire setting aside his phone, his attention fully on his father. The old man's hands trembled slightly as he reached for the food, but this time, he didn't eat in silence. He began to speak softly, haltingly, but with words that carried years of unspoken feelings. "I thought I had lost you," the old man said, his voice heavy with both sadness and relief. His son lowered his head, shame flickering in his eyes. "I let my life swallow me," the son admitted. "Business, meetings, flights, endless deals, I thought providing was enough. But I forgot what mattered most." The young woman sat quietly, watching the two men slowly bridge a gap that had stretched for years. Her chest ached as she realized that her small act of kindness had played a role in this moment. She had never intended it, never imagined it, but somehow her simple meals had brought father and son face to face again. After the old man finished eating, his son turned toward her. His voice was steady, but his eyes carried deep emotion. "You did what I should have done," he said. "You saw him. You cared for him. And because of you, I have a chance to make things right." She shook her head quickly. "I only brought food," she replied softly. "That's all." But he didn't agree. "No," he said firmly. "You gave him dignity. You gave him company. That is worth more than all the money I have." The room fell into a tender silence, broken only by the sound of the old man's breathing. His eyes, usually so weary, glistened with a rare light. It was as if years of loneliness had been lifted from his shoulders in a single evening. Over the weeks that followed, things began to change. The luxury car appeared more often outside the old house. The billionaire's son visited regularly, sometimes staying overnight, sometimes simply sitting with his father in the evenings. Their bond, once fractured, began to heal slowly, piece by piece. And through it all, the young woman continued to visit, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. She had become part of something larger than she ever imagined, a quiet story of love, regret, and reconciliation. One evening, as she prepared to leave, the billionaire stopped her at the door. "I owe you more than I can ever repay," he said sincerely. "If there is anything you need, anything at all, please tell me." She smiled politely, shaking her head. "I don't need anything," she said. "All I wanted was to make sure he wasn't alone." The man looked at her for a long moment, and then nodded with respect. He understood. Some things couldn't be measured in wealth or favors. Word of the story eventually spread in the neighborhood. People whispered about the young woman who had shown kindness to the quiet old man, only to discover his son was one of the wealthiest men in the country. But she never sought attention. For her, the real reward was seeing the old man smile again, seeing a family brought back together, and knowing that kindness had the power to change lives in ways she never imagined. As she walked home under the fading evening sky, she thought about how it had all begun with a single meal, a simple gesture she hadn't even considered extraordinary. Yet that small act had uncovered a hidden truth, reunited a father and son, and reminded everyone who heard the story that compassion could reach where riches could not. And in that quiet truth lay the greatest secret of all. Sometimes, the smallest kindness carries the power to transform not just one life, but many.